In today's presentation, we're going to talk about early fashion photography, its significance, the photographers that played a big part in it, etc. So I hope you enjoy. The emergence of fashion photography as a distinct genre goes hand in hand with this up-and-coming illustrated magazine industry in the early 1900s. So 1909 is when we see Vogue. It started already, but it is transformed by the big publisher Condé Nast into a high-class fashion publication. And in 1913, William Hearst, these are big names in publishing, big family names, lots of money, he launched Harper's Bazaar as a competition to Vogue. And in 1914, Vanity Fair is launched by Condé Nast, and that's more of a men's fashion magazine. In 1916, the British edition of Vogue is released, followed by a French edition in 1921. So these magazines were aimed mostly at wealthy women, or those that aspired to a life of luxury, right? Like today, even if we don't have a lot of money, we love to look at expensive items, clothing, people wearing certain things. So here we have 1909, we have a cover of Vogue. In the middle, we have Harper's Bazaar, and then on the right, we have Vanity Fair. I had shown you some photographs by Camille Sylvie before. These photographs here, they feature the upper class fashions of that time. So we can see how ornate the upper class were dressing as. And these are albumen prints. So 1862, 1861, seeing these styles was a big deal. And we spoke about Edward Steichen many times in a few different presentations, right? He was a pictorialist photographer, eventually went more towards realism, but here in his fashion photography, we're going to see his progression here. So Edward Steichen was commissioned to create 13 soft focus photographs for an article entitled The Art of the Dress. This photograph on the right here, we see his pictorialism. We've seen this before. I've shown you this picture before, the pond at moonrise in 1904. So we saw some of Steichen's work. We saw some of his realistic work showcasing the lower class in New York City. We saw his pictorialism, his soft focus landscapes, etc. But we haven't seen his fashion photography. Yes, he took breaks and he did these other pictorial pieces of art, but here in the 1920s, he started taking pictures of fashion again. And he called this group of images he took the first serious fashion photographs ever made, right? So maybe a little full of himself, but nevertheless, they were beautiful. Here we see the start of it. This is The Art of the Dress, and it was done in 1911. Here's more from that series, The Art of the Dress, which was published in an Art and Decoration magazine, 1911. We can see this pictorialist view, right? This soft focus kind of blur around these subjects. It's beautiful. Let's discuss Adolphe de Meyer. He was the first official fashion photographer for Vogue. Many people attribute him to the first professional fashion photographer. He was appointed to that position in 1913. He moved to New York City. In 1922, de Meyer accepted an offer to become Harper's Bazaar chief photographer in Paris. So he spent the next 16 years there, and here's a self-portrait of him. So here we actually have an unpublished fashion study for Vogue in 1919. So this was actually not published, but it was a study for a piece that might have been published at some point. It was a test. So de Meyer had many social connections with people in high society. And many of his photographs seemed to be taken outdoors, but they were actually staged in his studio. So he was a master at making things look so natural, naturally lit anyway. He made this wonderful use of backlighting. Here we see this. We can see this seated woman here, and there's like a glow coming from behind her, right? So it's backlit. That's what we call backlit. So his photographs kind of emerged from a constrained, kind of repressed Victorian era. And the women in his photographs asserted their status. They had very theatrical manners. They showcased how independent they were and showcasing this expensive clothing that they were wearing. So while in Paris, he photographed a series of advertisements for Elizabeth Arden Cosmetics, and they featured the model Roberta Cusi. Now here we see this attention to, right, just the face. There's just simple draped fabric over her. She kind of removed a mask to showcase her beauty. The use of these Elizabeth Arden cosmetics. By the time the 1930s hit, Demers' career kind of hit a standstill. He failed to adapt to a more modern and avant-garde way of thinking. And we're going to see that from other fashion photographers, how modern they became, how avant-garde, how different they started to create artwork, photography, fashion photography in general. And we're going to see this modern aesthetic in Edward Steichen's work. He became Condé Nast chief of photography in 1923. And he brought a very modern look to fashion imagery. He worked with many geometric principles of Art Deco design. And in 1923, less than 15% of illustrated advertisements in magazines used photography. But within a decade of that, it was 80%. So it jumped completely. So here we see this avant-garde approach. We see this model, this actress Gloria Swanson, 1924, Vanity Fair. Now here we see this, right, this beautiful image, but there's an overlay on top of her, this kind of lace patterned overlay. So here we have a very important cover. This is the 1932 cover of Vogue. It's the first photographic cover that is in full color for Vogue. This is a big deal, right? People are used to seeing black and white images. So yes, color was used, but back and forth with black and white. Here we have Edward Steichen's black model. This is Margaret Horan in a black dress, okay? This was in 1935's edition of Vogue. But we can see here this beautiful abstraction that's being created by these dark silhouetted shapes of the piano, the column on her left, to her left, right? The bar of black underneath her and the piano. Now we can see influences here. So on the right, I had showed you this in the last presentation, Paul Strand. This is his abstraction, Twin Lakes in Connecticut in 1916. So right now we can kind of see influence here. So initially most photographers, most fashion photographers as well, only love to use natural light. And honestly, it's beautiful. Natural lighting, there's nothing like it. Have a model next to a window, it's beautiful. But there was this change coming, a change towards electric lighting. Now this allowed photographers to shoot on cloudy days, at night, etc. And they were playing with different ways of diffusing light to make it look natural. And here we see Marlene Dietrich in 1934. It's beautiful. It's beautifully lit. We can see the source of lighting is the upper right of the frame, kind of cast downwards on her. So in 1923, Steichen was on a roll. He was very sought after. He signed a contract with the advertising agency J. Walter Thompson, and he created advertising images for the next 15 years. Steichen's decision to work commercially, it appalled Alfred Stieglitz. Now, Alfred Stieglitz, if you remember, was very close with Steichen. Um, Alfred Stieglitz kind of thought of him as a protege, all right? But he was appalled by this commercial work that he was doing. He kind of thought he was a sellout. And he believed that art should be made for art's sake alone. So here we're going to talk about George Hoyanen Huna in 1900 to 1968. And he was an established fashion photographer through the 1920s and 1930s. And he worked alongside many famous photographers in Paris and New York City. By 1925, he had already worked his way up to chief of photography of the French Vogue magazine. So Hoyanen Huna created very refined studio pictures. He was definitely inspired by ancient Greek sculpture and classical forms. If you studied art before, classical Greek sculpture idolized the body, showcased the muscles, the forms. And we can see that. We can even see that here starting. We can see this idealization of the body broken down to forms. We see the muscles in that man's arm on the left. So Hoyanen Huna was most celebrated for beach fashion photography, swimwear, etc. And here we see that. The fashions of the time, 1929. But we see these classical looking poses. We see this woman, her arm is up, her arm is on her torso. She's a little bit of a contrapposto position, meaning one leg is the supporting leg, one leg is bent. Her face is in a different position than her body. And in this, we further see this classical sculpture influence, right? We see that with the torso on the right, and then we see this beautiful lady right here, draped in beautiful fabric in this pose on the left. So Horst P. Horst was a very big deal in the fashion industry. But in 1930, that's when he first started. He met Vogue photographer George Hoyanen Huna, and he became his first photographic assistant, also his model and his lover. And in 1931, Horst began his association with the Vogue magazine, publishing his first photograph in the French edition, which was a very big deal. And he continued working well after World War II and beyond. The next few photographs really showcase his quality of work. This one right here, this corset photo, is something that photographers all know. You study this in art school. The beautiful lighting, the way the fabric is, the ribbon of the corset is draped off of that table, her positioning, etc. So in this photograph and the photograph before it, we saw Salvador Dali's work, handiwork. Horst frequently collaborated with this artist, with Salvador Dali. So here we have Salvador Dali's ink drawing, which was done over a photograph by Horst P. Horst. So it's a drawing and a photograph. So we're going to keep going. There's a lot of photographers here. Here we have Paul Outerbridge, 1896 to about 1958. And in 1925, he established himself as an innovative advertising photographer and graphic designer as well. He moved to Paris and he worked for the French edition of Vogue magazine. In 1930, having returned to New York, Outerbridge began to experiment with color photography. He focused primarily on female nudes, striking full-color images that were ahead of his time, very graphic, and we'll see that in the next few slides. So color photography was new, yes, at this point, but it was viewed more as a commercial medium, not an artistic form, because it was just copying what was in front of them. Um, Outerbridge challenged it. He wanted to make it art, make it more of personal expression. He used this Carbro color process, which separated different tones, magenta, yellow, and cyan. And it allowed him to naturalistically reproduce subtle skin tones and variations in his nudes, which was not able to be done before. It was very, all the skin photography, skin color photography before that was very one toned, right? We didn't see many different colors and textures of skin. It basically just made it all one tone, even though it wasn't. So let's move on. Alexei Brodovich. He was a Russian-born photographer, designer, and instructor, most famous for his art direction of the fashion magazine Harper's Bazaar. And he did this from 1934 to 1958 and immediately transformed the magazine into a true rival of Vogue. He insisted that each page have a shock value of its own, and he wanted to set this magazine apart. He cut paper dolls out of patterned paper or illustration perfume bottles to look like high-key photography. Whatever was unlike other fashion magazines, he tried. Here we see a very modern approach, right? We can see the text on the right kind of looks like a Z, right? It's in this different format. And it is mimicked with the fashion model on the left. Here's another example of that, right? We see the text and how it's curved on the right in the same direction as the woman on the left and how her body's curved as well. So this photograph was done by George Hoynan Hoon, but art directed by Brodovich. So as you can see, these are all designed by him and photographed by somebody else. We see on the right, this big instrument, right? We see the woman next to it. And then on the left, we see this woman superimposed on a harp. The way he laid out his pages was like nothing anyone had seen before. Each page led into the next. So we see the woman on the left here, right? Her mouth is open, she's kind of yelling towards the woman on the right. And the woman on the right is giving this kind of like look, holding her cigarette, kind of like, what are you talking about, lady? All right. Now this was shot by Richard Avedon. We're going to speak about him. Fantastic photographer. And we can see this use of page next to page talking to one another. So Martin Mukansky was a newspaper writer, a photographer in Hungary. He specialized in sports specifically. But in 1934, he left for New York, where he signed on for a substantial $100,000, especially at that time. It's a big amount of money with Harper's Bazaar. So you can see by this amount of money in 1934 how much the publication industry was making from these magazines. It's incredible. So in a change from usual practice, he left the studio to shoot outdoors. He went on location, on the beach, on farms, in fields, at airports. These are not studio shots we're going to look at now.